There's an anomalous phenomenon in our world, and I'm not talking about the strange things that people have been seeing in the skies or even under the oceans. I'm talking about an anomalous phenomenon happening in the heart of our governments. Generals, admirals, colonels, secretaries of state, defense and intelligence insiders, congressmen and women, and senators are all coming out and saying the same thing. Non-human intelligence is real, they say, and our generation is going to be the one that's going to have to confront it and deal with it head on.
Humanity is not the only intelligence in the universe.
Humanity is not the only intelligent species.
We are absolutely not alone.
Non-human intelligence exists, UAPs are real, they're here, and they're not human.
This story is huge. It's vast. It's literally cosmic. It touches on our very sense of human identity, taps into our spirituality, and even seems to hint at some sort of destiny. And it's all of these things that make it ripe for exploitation. How would you know whether what is being said is true or it's all entirely false? We need somebody who is not part of the UFO disclosure movement, who isn't owned and controlled by the Pentagon, and yet can legitimately say that they've been an insider into the events of UFO disclosure. And that, my friends, is why today we're taking a deep dive into the journals of Jacques Vallee, specifically focusing on Forbidden Science Volume 6, where he documents his experiences from the years 2010 to 2019. These are the critical years that we need to look at in order to ask the question whether or not what is going on around us can be trusted. It's in these years that our world went from believing that UFOs were laughable to featuring them in the mainstream media and asking, what are they? It's in these years where we've gone from the defense and intelligence community stonewalling any attempt to discuss the topic to having insiders trickle out and begin to tell us strange and bizarre stories about non-human intelligence. Jacques Vallee will give us an insider's perspective. Why is disclosure happening? When did it start? Who was it that made the final decision? What was the deal with Tom DeLonge and To the Stars Academy? Who were the secret advisors? And what was it that they were whispering to Tom behind closed doors? What did the likes of Jim Semivan and Chris Mellon really think about what he was saying? Is there any truth to this 2027 narrative and the idea that we're facing some sort of existential crisis? And who are these bizarre characters like Lou Elizondo and even the mysterious Dr. Ronald Pandolfi? And what role might they have been playing in UFO disclosure? If you've ever asked just one of these questions, I guarantee you that today you're going to have a feastful of new insights. Most importantly, by the time we're done, the way you think about UFO disclosure and who you can and can't trust will have changed forever. Make yourself comfortable. This is going to be a big one. If I was to ask you when this modern wave of UFO disclosure really began, what would you say? Perhaps you'd go back to the 2017 New York Times article. Maybe you'd go back a little bit further to the formation of To the Stars Academy of Arts and Sciences, with that lineup of defense and intelligence insiders all coming out speaking in unison. Or perhaps you'd go back a little bit further to those Tom DeLonge interviews in 2016, where we heard those mysterious rumors about a group of advisors pushing him towards UFO disclosure. Or maybe, if you're a real student of the topic, you'd go back to that infamous Podesta tweet in February of 2015. But what if I told you that the real origins of disclosure go further back than that? What if I told you that the rumors about a possible disclosure movement didn't just go back to 2015 or even just 2014, but could be found right at the beginning of 2013? This is one of the most fascinating revelations we get from Vallee's most recent journals. Here's the man himself. Someone floats a rumor, one more, that the White House has moved away from disclosure and now leans towards confirmation. Is someone feeding fake revelations in the media to gauge reactions? I'm told confirmation will be rolled out next year. And just a few days later, he follows up with a second entry. The group strongly believes there will be some sort of confirmation soon, and it will confirm an alien presence. At least that's what my friends are being told by people they trust in Washington, supposedly close to the White House. At this point, Vallee doesn't seem completely convinced that this confirmation plan is really legitimate. He half jokes at the beginning of one entry about the fact that rumors are coming out of the White House, and then he presents it as being the group, this is the group of his friends who used to be in the ORSAT program, as presenting this idea to him, but not necessarily saying that he himself buys into it. But just a few months later, we get this next entry, where Vallee is giving advice to Bob Bigelow. My short-term advice is to study carefully the reactions to the disclosure campaign and the Washington pseudo hearings. This will be a test of the media's attitude. Absent a solid core of new scientific data, which has not been assembled, we may enter a period of confusion and pointless ideological battles between various factions of the scientific community. There's a simple answer. My concern is that once confirmation occurs, the public will be quick to demand answers and will be manipulated once again into a pre-packaged belief system. Isn't it fascinating that all the way back in 2013, the likes of Jacques Vallee, Bob Bigelow, and their colleagues, including people like Kit Green, Eric Davis, John Schuessler, and many of the other scientists associated with the ORSAT program and Bigelow Aerospace, were all hearing whispers about a plan coming out of the White House. Now, we've covered on the channel the fact that Bill Clinton had a major push for disclosure in the 90s. But honestly, with all the material available online, people rarely focus in on the Obama administration. But here we're hearing from Vallee that the roots for a plan of confirmation, whatever that means, we'll discuss it shortly, actually came out of the beginning of the second term of Barack Obama. That's quite a remarkable finding already. Now you might be asking, look, that's great, a few journal entries talking about this idea of confirmation, but how can I connect this to modern day disclosure? Well, here's Tom DeLonge, 1,753 days later on the Joe Rogan Experience.
That's a bizarre formula, right? An entertainment company that's also gonna
do aerospace and science.
Yeah.
And the heart of it is when we do what's called confirmation, not disclosure, confirmation. When we do what's called confirmation, not disclosure, confirmation.
Isn't that interesting? That 4 years later, after these little whispered conversations in a back room of the White House, a famous rock star is on the biggest podcast in the world, specifically delineating between disclosure and confirmation. This implies planning. It implies strategy, and it also implies that this conversation, this distinction that came out of the Obama White House, is directly related to the modern UFO disclosure movement. Now, you might be asking yourself, what's the difference between confirmation and disclosure? And you know what? The truth is, I don't have the answer for that. But I'll give you a stab of what I think makes sense. In this context, confirmation sounds like a halfway step between disclosure, which presumably was deemed to be shocking and potentially wouldn't have got pushed through the defense and intelligence community, and doing nothing at all, which didn't seem to be an option for them at this point, and we'll come to why a little bit later. Instead, confirmation sounds like a middle path, like the idea that you could present new information, that you could confirm that alien life exists without necessarily having to reveal all of the details, or indeed open a can of worms about crimes committed and people hurt. If you think about the complexity of the defense and intelligence community and its culpability in what's happened over the last 100 years or so, you can understand why they might be slightly more open to the idea of a softball confirmation rather than a full-blown disclosure. Now, what would constitute such a confirmation? Well, one of the first things that you'd want to do is you'd want to reacclimatize a population that has just spent the last century laughing and scorning at the idea of alien life, let alone UFOs. So how would you do that? Well, as we're going to see, NASA was about to start behaving very strangely. For many in the scientific community, the notion of life existing beyond our planet has always been a topic that's inspired skepticism. In 2011, the British astrophysicist John Gribbin released a book titled Alone in the Universe: Why Our Planet is Unique. Here's a quotation from his book, which more or less sums up the intellectual climate at the start of the 21st century. The Milky Way contains a few 100 billion stars, but almost certainly contains only one intelligent civilization. When this book was released, it didn't send shockwaves anywhere. Most people had already resigned themselves to the idea that believing in life beyond the planet was woo-woo, that it wasn't to be taken seriously, which must have made it all the more shocking when in 2013, NASA suddenly seemed to have a lot of news and press releases about the idea of life beyond our planet. The surge of news started in April 2013, just 3 months after the whispers of a confirmation program being talked about in the White House. The first news came from NASA's Kepler mission, which had discovered 2 new planetary systems with 3 super-Earth planets which were in the habitable zone. This was a source for much excitement. NASA even held a press conference where Max Planck Institute for Astronomy scientist Lisa Kaltenegger made the following provocative statement.
This fascinating idea is that maybe we've actually found the first ocean planets, the first water worlds out there.
As a quick side note, hosting that conference is another man of interest, General Pete Worden. We'll come back to him a little bit later, but for now, back to the surge of news coming out of NASA. Almost exactly 1 year later, in April of 2014, NASA's Kepler mission would have more news, this time identifying the first Earth-sized planet inside of a habitable zone. Everything was moving in a positive direction, incremental progress towards identifying planets similar to ours, but nothing too crazy to get excited about. Well, that was until the chief scientist at NASA, Ellen Stoffen, made the following astonishing statement in 2015 at a public panel in Washington.
Well, I'm going to go out a little bit on a limb here, and I'm going to say I think we're going to have strong indications of life beyond Earth within a decade, and I think we're going to have definitive evidence within 20 to 30 years.
This marked a considerable sea change for NASA, a brand and an organization which had always been cautious about talking about life beyond our planet. Suddenly wasn't just releasing press releases about astonishing findings from the Kepler mission, but was now making provocative promises about what was to come, setting a sense of expectation amongst the population. And from here, the news simply continued. Just a few years later, they would identify a single star system with 7 Earth-like planets all orbiting around the star in the habitable zone. In that same year, in April of 2017, Dr. Thomas Zurbuchen, an associate administrator at NASA, in a House Committee on Science, Space, and Technology, would state that we're on the verge of one of the most profound discoveries ever. Talk about turning the temperature up and raising expectations. But ever since then, the news simply hasn't stopped. I wonder if you remember that news story about signs of life in the clouds of Venus. Did you sleep on the fact that it was announced that there may be oceans on the surface of Neptune and Uranus? What about the oceans underground on Mars and the microbial life that was identified there just the other day? And none of this is to mention the strongest signs of life outside of our own solar system with planet K2-18b. We're truly living in a new age of announcements and discoveries as it pertains to the discovery of life beyond our world. And isn't it fascinating how, on the one hand, this fulfills what Ellen Stoffen said with such boldness in 2015, but also how it aligns with the whispers about a confirmation program out of the White House at the beginning of 2013. These dates match up. Suddenly, you have a change in NASA's output just at the moment that the White House seems to be rolling out a quiet and subtle plan, not of disclosure, but of confirmation. And it wasn't just NASA who were behaving strangely. Suddenly, on late-night chat shows, presidents were being asked provocative questions. Here is President Bill Clinton in 2014.
Bill Clinton is here with us, so if I was president, and I won't be, let's be honest, the first thing I would do after putting my hand on that Bible and taking that oath to serve the country is I wouldn't even probably finish the oath. I would run to the White House. I demand to see all the classified files on the UFOs. Because I want to know. I'd want to know what has been going on. Did you do that?
Sort of. We had the anniversary of Roswell.
You waited that long?
I did.
Wow.
First, I had people go look at the records on Area 51 to make sure there was no alien down there. And people thought that because everybody who works there has to stop about an hour away and put on special clothing and then drive in and out. And that's because a lot of our stealth technology is made there. We know that now, but there are no aliens there. So then when the Roswell thing came up, I knew we'd get, gazillions of letters. So I had all the Roswell papers. What do we know? We know now we live in an ever-expanding universe. We know that there are billions of stars and planets literally out there, and the universe is getting bigger. We know from our fancy telescopes that just in the last 2 years, more than 20 planets have been identified outside our solar system that seem to be far enough away from their suns and dense enough that they might be able to support some form of life. It makes it increasingly less likely that we're alone.
Oh, you're trying to give me a hint that there are aliens.
No, I'm trying to tell you I don't know.
Oh.
But if we were visited someday, I wouldn't be surprised. I just hope it's not like Independence Day.
Yeah, right.
That it's a conflict.
If you think that Bill Clinton didn't want to be asked this question, then you just don't know how the media works. And guess what? In 2015, Kimmel would ask the same question to Barack Obama.
So did you look? Did you see? Did you explore?
I can't reveal anything.
Oh, really? Because President Clinton said he did go right in and he did check and there was nothing.
Well, that's what we're instructed to say.
All right.
The aliens won't let it happen. You reveal all their secrets. They exercise strict control over us.
I wonder how much you're reading his body language, knowing what we now know from Vallee's journals. And none of this is to mention Hillary's interview, which would happen in the middle of the 2016 election cycle.
I would like us to go into those files and hopefully make as much of that public as possible. If there's nothing there, let's tell people there's nothing there.
What if there is something there?
Well, if there is something there, unless it's a threat to national security, I think we ought to share it with the public.
Just over a year ago, I did a deep dive into the 2016 election. And we looked at all of the different activities going on around UFOs at the time of that election. The reality is that Hillary and Podesta were being extremely forthcoming with the topic of UFOs. It wasn't just that they were having a little silly interview with Jimmy Kimmel. When Lena Dunham interviewed Hillary Clinton, Podesta immediately tweeted her afterwards in front of all of his followers and all of Hillary's followers and all of Lena Dunham's followers. And this is what he said. "Great interview, Lena Dunham. But Lena, ask her about aliens next time. #the truth is out there." We also know from the leaked WikiLeaks emails that when Hillary Clinton was preparing for her interview with Jimmy Fallon, she'd practiced talking on the topic of aliens, and she was disappointed when it didn't end up coming up. Also in those same emails, people working in Clinton's campaign referenced a UFO project, implying that the team and the larger organization was aware of some kind of initiative around the UFO issue. Now, I've had people say to me, yes, they were interested in UFOs and they were talking about it, but it wasn't front and center. It's not that much of a big deal. But the fact that they were talking about it at all and that they had an internal communication strategy around it implies something very mysterious. Just a few years before Clinton would run, Dennis Kucinich would also take a punt at trying to become the Democratic nominee. During his debate, on stage you had a whole host of future superstars of the Democratic Party. Joe Biden, Hillary Clinton herself, Barack Obama, and others. And in that debate, Dennis Kucinich didn't even say anything about UFOs. He just got asked a question about a UFO experience that he had had in his personal life. As Kucinich tried to answer the question, the audience turned and laughter began. And from there on, his entire campaign was colored and ruined by that moment.
Did you see a UFO? I did, and the rest of the account, it was unidentified flying object, okay? It's like, it's unidentified. I saw something.
Now, for Hillary Clinton and for any other Democrat on that stage, you've just watched one of your colleagues lose the opportunity to win the Democratic nominee simply by being associated with the topic of UFOs. And here we are in 2013, 14, 15, and 16, and increasingly that same Democratic Party is embedding the UFO topic, yes, not front and center, but around the fringes of their campaigns. You've got to ask why. It makes you wonder if you can trace all of that back to 2013 and these entries that Vallee documents. Ultimately, I can't prove to you that this is all part of a consistent strategy. But if you did want to slowly reacclimatize the population to the idea that life might be out there, and that UFOs aren't just something to be laughed at, this is exactly how you would do it. Dripping the conversation into the news media through an authoritative brand like NASA, one of the most trusted brands in the world, and by having the most authoritative people in your nation start to discuss the topic in mainstream media. As University of Michigan psychologist Robert Zajonc found in his studies, repeated exposure of an idea to an individual is all it takes for them to get more comfortable with it. You don't necessarily have to argue for the credibility of a certain hypothesis if you just keep presenting it consistently and repetitively over time. For most of the human population, the fact that UFOs, aliens, and life on other planets has been talked about more and more over the last 12 years is enough for them to begin to see the topic differently. Now, you already knew that UFO disclosure was going on, as did I. The fact that we can trace its origins back to 2013 is fascinating, but it raises another bigger question. And that question is this: why 2013? What was it that meant that the White House went from a posture of denying and deflecting on the UFO topic to quietly triggering a process of acclimatization and confirmation? Well, to answer that question, we need to go back to Vallee's journals. And believe me, what I'm about to share will shock you. Ever since this new wave of UFO conversations began, people have been speculating about what is driving it. What are the motivations and reasons for this conversation to have been brought forward? What is it that's motivating defense and intelligence insiders to act with such urgency? We've heard whispers about the idea of time constraints, the idea that something might be coming. The years 2026 and 2027 have been thrown out there. The possibility that some sort of alien mothership might be on its way, and as these theories continue to build, they get more and more sensational, to the point that you can't even say 3-Eye Atlas without someone sending you some obscure AI-generated video of a giant mothership hovering above Earth. The movement has reached a kind of delusional fever pitch with this stuff, and I have to confess, once in a while I am curious. Could there be some truth to these rumors?
There is a sense of urgency because, people said, well, why now? Well, because it's not on our time scale, not on our timeline. It's not up to us. They're here, whether we want to acknowledge it or not. They're here. The question is why? What's the purpose?
The only thing that would make a politician do that and act in that sort of enhanced way where they're in a hurry is that there's some bad news involved in this.
Look, I've got a pretty clear idea of what the government knows, and I can understand why they're moving to expedite. Yes, there is a constraint of time.
But what's the timeline that these scientists have related to you?
I was told, this was like last year, I was told between 5 and 7 years.
A lot of what we take for granted now in life, I don't think is going to be, we're not going to have it. A lot of things we have now that makes our lives as wonderful as they are. I'm just concerned. That's all.
Yeah.
So I don't think 10 years in the future. I only think 3 or 4 years into the future.
Right. Yeah. Now I'll say this much. That year has come up in a classified setting, in a skiff that I was in Washington, D.C. I was asked, John, what have you heard about 2027 and this phenomenon?
But for the most part, I try and hold these ideas at a distance. Mostly because I believe that they're the perfect way to control a disclosure movement like the one that we're all trying to push forwards. By proposing the idea that UFO disclosure is going to happen inevitably because something's going to arrive here, potentially in 2026 or 2027, you create a passive UFO disclosure movement. People stop actively researching and trying to figure out what's going on because the truth is it's all going to be revealed in just a couple of years anyway. It's a perfect myth to control a passionate movement like ours. Well, that perspective made it all the more shocking when I read Vallee's journals earlier this year. It turns out Vallee has quite a few things to say on the idea that something might be coming. In 2013, almost exactly the time period when confirmation was being whispered about, Vallee recounts a dialogue with one of his colleagues from the ORSAT program. Here's the man himself. My view of the phenomenon has changed. I think the human race is in a precarious position. I want to make the world a better place, but something is coming. The group felt that an existential threat had been detected. I bet you weren't expecting that. And note how this journal entry goes back to 2013. In fact, just a few months after the whispers of confirmation began out of the White House. Vallee never ties these two things together, but it is hard, as a curious reader, not to do that. On the one hand, you start to hear whispers about a confirmation program coming out of the White House, just at the same time that Vallee and his colleagues start to believe there might be some sort of existential threat that's been detected. Once again, we can't conclusively tie those things together, but it really is fascinating that they're both happening at the same time. Just a few months later, as Vallee and his colleague John Schuessler were planning to meet up, he reflects on the fact that Schuessler won't be attending this upcoming meeting. This is what Vallee writes. I am especially sorry not to see John. I am intrigued by his feeling that there is a horrific threat level behind what we are seeing. I do feel the same way, often. Finally, it's important to tie this back to the work that Vallee and his colleagues had actually done in the ORSAT program. ORSAT wasn't just about Skinwalker Ranch. There was a lot more going on in the project. One of the biggest accomplishments of the program was the work that Vallee was involved in. He spearheaded the creation of a data warehouse, which he called Capella. This merged 12 existing UFO databases, summarizing 240,000 cases, looking at each of those cases with 6 levels of analysis, including physical, anti-physical, psychological, physiological, psychic, and cultural. Now, today is not the day to go deep into Capella, but for those of you who are interested, as part of this video preparation, I actually did create a lot of content on Capella. I'm just choosing not to present it today because I don't want to slow down the flow of this narrative. But if you're interested, join the Patreon. You can even join as a free member, and I'm pretty sure you'll still get access to that. And at some point, I'm going to upload a deep dive on all of this content, including Capella. But just to give you a high-level summary, that's 240,000 cases, each analyzed at 6 levels. And as George Knapp wrote in his written testimony at the recent UFO hearings, this was the world's largest known UFO database ever, with an astonishing level of analysis involved. Now, why am I telling you this? Well, firstly, it's just kind of fascinating. But secondly, when you do that level of analysis, you find things. And this next entry helps us to see how Vallee's perspective of some sort of emergent threat is actually tied to the UFO data as well. In this entry, Vallee is recounting a conversation that he had with Dr. Colm Kelleher. Here are his words. It's a huge mistake to structure a project the way the government established and controlled our study. The phenomenon is too vast and complex to work on it part-time. Unless there's a sizable, well-trained, knowledgeable team working 7 days a week, we're dabblers with a high risk of failure. And just a little bit further ahead, he continues. It is critical to have top-of-the-line database support. The Capella database was brilliantly conceived. Databases are the lifeblood of the project. On a personal note, It was only through poring over the BAS database that it first dawned on me that this phenomenon was a threat. Now, we need to delineate between two different things that I think are being said in these entries. First, let's start with what we just spoke about, the Capella database. Like I said, 240,000 cases which are being analyzed in incredible depth. And it's off the back of this vast study that Vallee and Kelleher and potentially other people began to perceive the phenomenon to be a threat. That is a generic threat, but this seems to be quite different to what is being said in the earlier entry from 2013. So let me just reread that because I want to highlight this. My view of the phenomenon has changed. I think the human race is in a precarious position. I want to make the world a better place, but something is coming. And this is then followed up by Vallee saying that the group felt that an existential threat had been detected. This seems much more specific than a generic threat. It's possible that I'm overinterpreting this, and it's possible that Vallee here is genuinely just talking about the same thing, but the way I read this is there is a generic threat behind the phenomenon, and that there's a specific threat that has been detected. Either way, even if you only have one of those, or if they're both the same thing, this probably does explain why UFO disclosure needed to be pushed forward in some kind of way, even if it was just a halfway house of confirmation, whatever that means. I don't want to throw more oil onto the fire of the 2027 rumors. And personally, I really don't believe that 2027 is the year. But I do wonder whether something may have been detected and whether all of this activity that we've been seeing may be related to it. I don't know. I don't have the insider information. But frankly, I think these entries from Vallee are astonishing, and I'm amazed that no one is talking about them. So far, all the people who have talked about existential threats seem to lack credibility. But here is, in my personal opinion, one of the most credible people in this entire movement. In fact, he's credible because he's not really part of the movement. And he here is sharing in his journals that the ORSAP group of scientists felt an existential threat had been detected. What does this mean? Vallee does not expand on it. Is there any truth to it? We have no way of knowing. But personally, I'm going to bet a few more chips on the idea that something is coming. Whatever urgency it was that ultimately drove the White House to trigger its confirmation plans is very likely the same urgency which triggered all of the strange activity around Tom DeLonge and To the Stars Academy in 2016 and 2017. For the longest time, all we've had to go on has been WikiLeaks emails and obscure coast-to-coast interviews that DeLonge did before his advisors were ousted. But now, with Vallee's latest journals, we've got a new insider perspective into one of the strangest tales in UFO history. Coming up in part 2, we're finally going to get an insider's perspective into what really happened. Who were the other mysterious advisors? What were they whispering to Tom behind closed doors? What did the likes of Lou Elizondo and Jim Semivan really think about what Tom was being told? And is it true that the mysterious Dr. Ronald Pandolfi was also advising Tom? All of these topics matter because whether or not we can trust that movement and whether or not we can have confidence in those people has a huge bearing on whether or not we can take seriously this modern UFO disclosure movement. So if you're interested in seeing that, then make sure to stick around for part 2, which will be released very soon. In the meantime, as we wrap up, I just want to say a few closing things. Firstly, I just want to say a huge thank you to everybody who's subscribed and is commenting and liking the videos. You guys owe me nothing. You owe me nothing. And yet you're here spreading enthusiasm and supporting the channel, and it just means so much. Thank you so much. Secondly, to all of those who are supporting the channel on Patreon, I don't even know what to say. I set that up silently a couple of months ago in preparation for speaking about the Patreon account, only to find that people had already started signing up and committing money to support this channel and this effort. thank you. Honestly, it has been hugely humbling, and it's given me hope that I may in fact be able to do this work full time at some point in the future. So thank you so much. And for those of you who do want to support and have the means to support this work, please do consider signing up at Patreon. And even if you don't want to sign up, you can just join for free, and there's a whole bunch of interesting content there. I'm going to be posting a huge deep dive on this topic because, believe it or not, we've only scratched the surface in part 1, and in part 2 we're only going to be able to scratch the surface as well. So if you want the deep dive inside a story, even just sign up as a free member, you can still get access to it there on Patreon. But with all of that said, make sure to tune in for part 2. My name is Jason Samosa. This has been Jason Samosa's Ufology Moment. And until next time.